Good morning and welcome to the Sunday School lesson for today. I'm glad that you're joining in. This week, we have been honoring veterans for their service to our country. If you've ever been on a trip to Washington, D.C., and if you haven't, I suggest that you go one day. You have lots of opportunities to visit memorials honoring past leaders and even soldiers who were unknown. And I know that even if you haven't been there, if you travel along the highways in our country, you'll see bridges and roads and streets and buildings that have been named in honor of leaders who have made an impact on our nation, many of whom died in the line of duty. We honor our parents and our grandparents who worked tirelessly. A lot of them had multiple jobs to provide opportunities for their children. We celebrate people who made and who do make sacrifices for the benefit of others. We enjoy the celebrations of people who do those things. Well, in Isaiah, the prophet told of a servant who unselfishly gave an ultimate sacrifice for the benefit of others. And our lesson today will be coming from chapter 53 in Isaiah. In his books, there were about, I think, four songs, servant songs is what they were called. It was groups of scriptures, and each one was a different song, and it was a servant song. They initially were about the collective nation of Israel because that was the servant, but they eventually turned to an unnamed, unknown individual. And all that Isaiah foretold was repeated later in the New Testament books. So we know that this individual was Jesus. However, Isaiah's prophecies were given to Judah about 700 years before Jesus was born. Still, he gave a remarkable description of how Jesus' life, his ministry, his death, and his resurrection unfolded 700 years before he was born. At the time of Isaiah's prophecy, Israel had become a nation that was hardened to God's authority. They were exiled because of their unfaithfulness, their idol worship, but there was also hope for them. And hope was an expected assurance because God said that he would redeem and he would restore that nation. More importantly, the servant from Isaiah's prophecies would also offer redemption for people of other countries, other nationalities at that time and centuries beyond the time of Isaiah's writings. The book of Isaiah is a foretelling of what would happen in the future, but the verbiage used was in actually as if it had already happened or it was in the present tense. And that was because it was a message from God. And God himself in chapter 46, verse 11 of Isaiah said, I have spoken it, I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it, I will also do it. Therefore, when God speaks of what will happen, we can know that it will come about just as he says in his time. Remember, there was a 700-year span of time here. But Isaiah, when you read the scriptures and then you compare what he said to the books in the New Testament of what actually had occurred, you'll see how clear God was speaking to his people. So our first scriptures for today come from Isaiah chapter 53, and it's going to be verses 1 through 3. Who hath believed our report? And to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. He's speaking of that servant, that individual servant now. It had just finished up chapter 52, and in that chapter it was foretold that the servant would have many successes in his mission, but it also depicted him as being so disfigured that no one wanted to look at him. And something seemed to be amiss with this kind of picture when God would use a person and they would have success, but then there would not be anyone that we would want to look at or be associated with. But now in these verses, the perplexity of that gets even more astonishing, because we wondered why God would allow his servant to have such a somber reception. For Isaiah's audience, the idea of a deliverer who suffers didn't really fit into their expectations. Someone who would deliver them from exile should arrive in grandeur with trumpets and armies, not just this ordinary person. And I don't know if you ever watch Disney movies, but if you've ever watched the Aladdin movie, I like the one that's not animated, the most current one, when Will Smith played the part of the genie. But when Aladdin enters into the area of the palace where Jasmine lives, there was a big parade. There were dancers and colorful costumes. It was a grand entrance. And if you think about from the Bible, David's entry into the city after a battle, when and there was dancing and cheering, and they shouted, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. That was a grand entrance. And that's sort of what they expected, because they expected a great military leader who was going to take them from Babylon and take them back to their homeland. This servant that Isaiah spoke of would enter quietly into his mission. According to these scriptures, he would grow just like any other ordinary child, and he would not stand out or get your attention in a crowd. His physical appearance was nondescript. It's just an ordinary person, nothing like the handsome King David or even Joseph, who lived in Potiphar's palace, and he had such a built physique. And if you remember, Potiphar's wife chased him relentlessly, and he was a handsome man. This servant would be just an ordinary person. He might not even get your attention in a crowd. So this situation may point out one of mankind's ungodly tendencies, and that is to judge too quickly on how something or someone looks to us. I know that I've done it many times. Just look at someone and think, oh, this, and then when you get to know them and you find out they're totally different from your first impression, or just from what you thought when you saw how they looked. I met a lady one time, and I thought, well, she's not very attractive in my eyes. But when I got to know her and I got to know her heart, she became one of the most beautiful people I had ever met in my life. And we do that. We judge too quickly about how something looks. We're so concerned about a public image when we really should be more concerned about what's inside, and we should be thankful that God sees our heart and he judges us by our heart and not by our outward appearance, because sometimes we don't look too godly. We don't look too nice. We don't act too nice, but God knows what's in our heart. But worse than this judgment, the servant had an ordinary existence and appearance, but worse than that, he was hated and treated with hostility by people who knew him. His life was characterized by grief and pain and distress. These people saw him as someone of no value or importance to them. It was a sad world. Now, if we'll read verses 4-6, the next scriptures. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. These verses explain how the servant would suffer physically, and also he would suffer. That physical suffering would be not because of his own sins, but it would be for our sins, for the sins of others. And it was a shameful situation, because at that time sinners regarded his suffering as evidence that God was not happy with him, and that it was God's wrath against him. They were blind to the reality that his suffering was because of their guilt and sin, and it was also because of our guilt and our sin. And not only was the servant abused, he was abused by God. Why would God do such a thing? They wondered. God's plan was to provide a way of salvation, and this servant became a willing sacrifice. The people of that time understood substitutionary suffering. I don't know if you've ever taken the punishment for someone else. One time I thought my nephew was going to take the punishment for me because I had cut a hole in Daddy's biggest watermelon to see if it was ripe, and he thought sure that my nephew had done it. I had to come clean and admit before he got a spanking. But they understood this substitutionary suffering, and that happened in Mesopotamia. If a king did something wrong, a commoner could take his place, take his punishment, and ultimately the commoner would be killed. But in this instance, the King of Kings was going to take the place of the commoner. They didn't understand it at the time, but we have the history, so we can look back and so we can't criticize them too much because we might have been in the same mindset if we were living at that time. But the sacrifices that were made for sin were, in the sacrificial system, they understood that too. It had to be an unblemished lamb. That was their sin sacrifice. It was a lamb, and of course, the lamb had done no wrong. But in this sense, the Israelites understood that placing sin upon that lamb and letting the lamb take their sin, that was a ritual that they went through, then their sins were forgiven. So they understood that. The servant would serve as this ultimate lamb, the unblemished lamb. They understood the sacrificial system. We don't have to do that, thank goodness. There are 7 ways noted in these verses here where the servant was our substitute. Number 1, he bore our sickness, our griefs, and our pain. He carried our pains. In other words, he carries our sorrows and our suffering. He was wounded for our transgressions. He didn't suffer with us. He suffered for us in our place. He was crushed. He was crushed emotionally and physically under the weight of the human transgressions. He took the punishment for our sins so our peace with God could be restored. When we're in a sinful situation and we have sin in our life, we don't have peace in our relationship with God. It's broken, not because of God, but because of us. Because of what this servant did, then our relationship could be restored with God to a peaceful relationship. He provided spiritual healing to others by his wounds or stripes. He became the substitute for we all and us all. That was the words that were used in these scriptures. We all and us all. And I think that was in verse 6, that maybe I didn't even get to that. It says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. We all and us all are stated in these scriptures. And sheep, if they're not guarded by a shepherd or herded up by a shepherd, they'll just wander off and get into trouble. We're just like that. We are just like that. We will wander away from God. That's our tendency, to be independent and to feel like we can do everything on our own. And he said, we all have done that. But so we can't judge these people. We can't point our finger at anyone else because we have us all, we all and us all. So now our next scriptures are verses 7 through 9. It says, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living, for the transgressions of my people was he stricken. And he made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Here the emphasis is made on how the servant willingly complied with the sacrifice, or with being the sacrifice. He did it without complaining. He displayed a silent acceptance of his oppression. Now you think about us in our everyday lives and how we whine and complain at times in our lives when we're not really suffering. We might experience a little inconvenience and we just complain and wine to no end. The perfect lambs that were used as sacrifices in the Old Testament didn't deserve their fates, but they would be led to the slaughter, not making any noise, not knowing what that was in store for them. They would be led to the shearers, not knowing what was in store for them. This servant knew exactly where he was going, and that he did it silently. He had suffered, he offered himself willingly. He went quietly as the lamb that was led to their brutal fate. And adding insult to injury, the servant faced his death with criminals, with the wicked. And you know the story. He was on the cross, and two thieves were on either side of him. At that time, too, riches were associated with blessings from God. You know, if you had suffering, then God was angry with you. If you were blessed, then God was, if you had riches, God was blessing you. So the riches were associated with blessings. Well, he was associated with the wicked when he was killed. But now, in his death, when he died, he might have been with the wicked, but now he was given a rich man's burial. The point being made was that the servant associated with all people, people from all walks of life, but he associated with those through crime, as the others on the cross, or through justice, unjust businesses. He gave himself for those who felt they were elevated above other members. They thought they were above all others, and he also gave himself for those who refused to believe. He would die on behalf of people who did not recognize him for what he was doing. As a matter of fact, it said they didn't see any value in him or think he was important to their lives. Very few would understand that his suffering and his death was for them. And even today, very few people understand the concept of something given so freely. We think we've got to earn something, or we've got to buy it. We've got to pay for it, or we've got to earn it. And a lot of people just have a hard time understanding that what he did was a free gift. And we just cannot comprehend that concept that someone would do something so miraculous for us. So our last scriptures for today are verses 10 through 12. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. Think about that. It pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see of the travail of his soul, or the trouble of his life. He's going to see that and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant, that would be one who is in a right relationship with God, justifies many, for he shall bear their iniquities, the ones that were listening to Isaiah's prophecies and the ones that live today. He was bearing their iniquities. Therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, and that would be the stubborn unbelievers, because he hath poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. Verse 10 poses an obvious question. How can a just, loving God not only take this servant, but desire such a thing for an innocent person? It said it pleased the Lord. And that it explains that God was pleased to crush him severely because there was no other way for human sin to be exposed and condemned, while also providing a way of forgiveness and eternal life for the sinners. The servant became the guilt offering, an offering for sin to satisfy the requirements for forgiveness and appeasement of God's rejection of sin. God rejects sin, and an appeasement had to be made. In the Old Testament, before Jesus was born, they had the sacrifices. He became the sacrifice. After his suffering and death, though, the servant would then understand God's sovereign purpose, and he would be exalted, or he would be glorified. He would be rewarded by each person who would be saved by his sacrifice. But even though some still would not accept that guilt offering of the servant, they will still be subject to him, but they will remain in a state of judgment for their refusal to recognize his work and what he did for them. Yet Jesus fulfilled his calling. He said himself in John 17:4 in the New Testament, it was recorded that Jesus said, I have glorified thee on the earth. I have finished the work which thou gavest me to do. We should all strive to be able to truthfully say that we finished the work that God has assigned us to do. He's got something for each and every one of us. And what a feeling of contentment and accomplishment it would be to be able to make that statement. So now let's think about how you would respond if you were asked by a loved one to go to the electric chair so a murderer on death row could go free. That would not be a happy request. We would not take that as a happy request. We would not like it. And I doubt that any of us would be give ourselves willingly, and especially not quietly. We would go kicking and screaming. Yet that is exactly what this servant from today's lesson did. He gave himself for that murderer. He gave himself for many people who we might think, well, they don't even deserve to live. He gave himself for them, just like he gave himself for the believers. And we need to be careful to not be thinking, well, this in the Bible, that was then and it's not now. Or, oh, well, that was just a story from a long time ago. The issue is the servant only had to give his life one time. They had to make sacrifices regularly before Jesus gave himself, but he only had to die one time. He did it for Isaiah's audience. He did it for everyone in every year and in every century since then, and for each of us today. So, how does knowing that strengthen our love and our commitment to him? Or does it even strengthen our commitment? Can we say, I finished what you called me to do? We really can't say that we finished, because I believe as long as you wake up every morning, there's still something that you can do. But can we honestly say, I'm still working on what you called me to do? I'm still using the talents that you've given me to do what you've called me to do. I'm doing that to glorify you. Can we say that? Do we commit ourselves to that? I want to thank you for joining once again. If you can make it, we have in-person Sunday school at 9 o'clock on Sunday mornings, and we would love to have you. Now I'm going to ask a special request. As many of you know, my sister Ethel was taken to the hospital last Sunday, and she's still there. She's a little bit better, but she's still got a ways to go before she's going to be released. And I also want to thank you for your prayers for a little boy that I've been asking for a long time, Levi, who has leukemia. He still has some chemo treatments. He's probably got another year or two of that. But it seems right now that his test is showing that he's making progress in the positive direction. And I know that many of you have helped to pray him up to this point. So I want to thank you for joining in today. And I hope you'll be back again next week. And I hope you'll have a blessed week. Thank you.